All right, here we go. Welcome everyone. I see participants joining. We're just going to wait just a couple of seconds so everybody can get in, and then we'll start. Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. The participant numbers kind of ticked down. All right, so here we go. Welcome everyone. My name is Jana Von Heen. I'm the Senior Director of Research and Clinical Strategy. Welcome today. I'm happy to introduce my co-host, Dominique Pichard, who is the Chief Science Officer at the International Rett Syndrome Foundation. And we're joined today by our guest speakers, James Valentine and Larry Bauer from Hyman Phelps and McNamara. So welcome to today's community webinar. We'll be discussing the Rett Syndrome Externally Led Patient-Focused Drug Development Meeting in preparation for our upcoming meeting with FDA later this spring. Go ahead, James. Okay, so I'm just going to do a brief introduction to this meeting, and then I'm going to turn it over to my co-host, Dominique, and she's going to introduce our speakers, and then James and Larry will take it away. We will follow up with the discussion section at the end of this webinar to address your questions. So just to get started, again, welcome everyone. We're very excited to have the opportunity to talk to you today about this exciting initiative. The Externally Led Patient-Focused Drug Development Meeting is an initiative that the FDA started to incorporate the patient voice into the drug development process. And so when Dominique and I reached out to FDA, a little over a year ago, we were really excited that they wanted to meet with us and learn about Rett syndrome. So this is really our unique opportunity to share Rett syndrome with FDA and drug developers. And our Rett syndrome drug development meeting will be a great opportunity for us to share our story, the Rett syndrome story, with FDA and drug developers. And this is your opportunity to tell FDA what your perspectives are and your experiences are with living with and treating Rett syndrome. And all of this information they then will take into account when they're considering new therapeutics. And they consider the patient perspective critical in making these decisions. And so the goal of today's webinar is really to inform you about the externally led patient-focused drug development meeting for Rett syndrome, so you know what to expect and how to participate. So the Rett Syndrome Research Trust and the International Rett Syndrome Foundation are co-organizing this meeting, and Dominique and I have been working together very closely for a long time at this point, trying to execute this meeting, working with different vendors, working with James and Larry to try to get this meeting to be the best representation of the Rett syndrome community and have the best meeting we can with FDA and drug developers. We do have a dedicated meeting website, which you can see here, RETTPFDD.org. You can find information about the meeting on this website, and we will continue to update it up into the meeting later this spring and thereafter as well. And then I'm just going to close my introduction with a couple of housekeeping items. This webinar should last about an hour. The format of this meeting is all participants are muted. If you have questions during the presentation, you can type them into the question and answer box at the bottom, and we'll be happy to address them in our discussion section at the end of the meeting. We are recording today's webinar, so it will be available later on our RETTPFDD.org website. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my co-host Dominique to mention anything that I missed and introduce our speakers.
Jana, thank you so much for starting off this meeting and for passing it over. I would like to now welcome James Valentine and Larry Bauer from Hyman Phelps and McNamara, who I've gotten to know over the past several months as they've been helping Jan and I plan this meeting. James has worked the last 13 years as a champion for the patient voice as part of the regulatory process. James previously worked at the FDA, where he was a patient liaison, helping to incorporate the patient voice into medical product review across the FDA's various medical product centers and review divisions. There, he helped to develop and launch the Patient-Focused Drug Development Initiative. Larry worked at the NIH for 17 years in clinical research, followed by a position at the FDA as a regulatory scientist in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research's Rare Disease Program, a group he co-founded and worked for 10 years, where he advanced rare disease drug development. In private practice, James and Larry have worked with many patient organizations to ensure their community's voice were heard by the decision makers. Relevant to our externally led patient-focused drug development meeting, they've been involved in helping plan and moderate 3/4 of over the 50 externally led PFDD meetings. So we are in great hands with James and Larry. With that, I will turn it over to them to teach us more about this meeting and how you can be involved. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominique, for that introduction, and to both you and Jana for having us here. You know, Larry and I are so excited as we've been helping as kind of consultants to you all in working to plan this meeting and bring our experience from the FDA and since. I'd like to welcome everybody in the Rett syndrome community that's here today, or maybe is watching this on demand in advance of the Rett community's externally led PFDD meeting. Today, you know, our goal is to give you background to help you prepare for participating in this meeting, maybe even help you decide. You might not know what an externally led PFDD meeting is. You probably don't have a reason to. So as part of your decision to participate, which we hope you will, you can learn more today. So, you know, what is this EL-PFDD meeting? As you'll hear us refer to it shorthand. What is this? This is an opportunity for us to educate the Food and Drug Administration, as well as other important stakeholders like drug developers, about what it is like to live with Rett syndrome, how Rett syndrome impacts your loved one's life, how you're currently managing Rett syndrome, and what meaningful new treatments might look like. These are all important considerations, as you'll hear later in the presentation, that will inform how trials are designed to study new drugs for Rett syndrome, and also helps inform FDA in evaluating those new drugs. So you might be wondering why you should participate. This is a very unique, perhaps a one-time opportunity to have your voices heard, at least in this way. FDA is going to be spending, you know, the majority of a day with us exclusively learning about Rett syndrome. And so this is important because FDA is responsible for approving all treatments for Rett syndrome in the United States. And so they need to know what's important to you. That understanding what is important to the caregivers and patients that experience Rett syndrome each and every day is going to help impact their decision-making, hopefully leading to better treatments and even faster approvals for Rett syndrome. We'll explain that approval process in a little bit as well, so you can see where your voices will actually fit into that. Another question you might have is why now? And part of this is just because of the history. Patient's voice had traditionally been absent from the drug development process. It wasn't essentially until something went wrong that the patient voice was brought in. You know, maybe a drug was approved, but you know, it was approved on outcomes that maybe aren't that important to patients, or even worse, some clinical trial was failing to demonstrate benefit, and we didn't really understand whether it was the drug at issue, or if it was maybe, you know, how we were running the studies and designing them that wasn't allowing us to really evaluate the drug benefit. And so that experience led to a culture shift when both Larry and I were at FDA, where the agency wanted to hear, you know, patient and caregiver voices, not just when, you know, those situations late in development, but throughout development and at the beginning of the process. And they've made stakeholder engagement a priority at FDA, including through initiating this patient-focused drug development program that more systematically brings your voices into their decision-making process, which again, we will be talking a great deal about today on this webinar. So now with just that little bit of high-level background, we're going to go into some more detail on some topics that we think are really important to inform your participation in this upcoming meeting. We're going to give you some background about FDA and drug development. It's important to know the context of what we're talking about in terms of drugs being developed and the decisions that FDA is involved in, and some things that they're not involved in. We'll then give you an introduction to FDA's patient-focused drug development, which will also help you understand, again, where your voices fit into that drug development process. And then we'll end kind of in the details of the meeting, giving you information about logistics, what to expect in terms of the format and how to participate, and some tips from our experience on how to best participate. So to jump into that first topic, giving you some background on FDA and drug development, let's start with understanding how a drug is actually developed, how we kind of get from the lab, the petri dish, so to speak, to the bench side, to all of you and your loved ones. So this begins with drug discovery. So research is going on well before we actually have a drug that's being considered for a disease. Basic science research, the kind of thing that NIH does or funds, and academic institutions, they're researching, Rett syndrome and the disease process itself to try to understand, what is going on and where there might be opportunities to try to stop or reverse the disease process. Those insights give us opportunities to look then at different compounds, whether small molecule drugs or maybe more advanced therapies like cell and gene therapy, to see where they might be able to intervene and have an effect on the largest number of patients within the disease. It's not only possible that we're looking at new novel therapies, but we may also be seeing where existing treatments could have an effect. This is called repurposing. And sometimes this can happen even just kind of naturally with use of drugs off-label. So once we have a sense of, that there's a promising compound, whether, a novel compound or an existing treatment that might have an impact, then we want to start actually evaluating that product, determining if it's safe and effective. And we're going to talk about what that kind of well-established path looks like. So the first thing we do is what's called preclinical development. Preclinical meaning, before the clinic or before testing in humans. And so this is, what you might imagine in terms of different testing, both for safety as well as to see if the drug has some effect, for example, in animal models of the disease, to, both get a sense of, is the drug safe? At what dose is it safe? And is it, do we see some early evidence that it has the potential to impact the disease in an important way? Once we do this and we collect that preclinical information, the drug developer or researcher puts that together in what's called an investigational new drug application, or IND for short. This is what authorizes a researcher to begin their first clinical trial in humans. So typically that first clinical trial that was in humans is called a phase 1 clinical trial. And you can see on the across the bottom here the different phases of trials. That phase 1 clinical trial can only commence once FDA reviews that IND submission. That will include those non-clinical or preclinical studies that I mentioned, pharmacology being the types of studies that look to see if the drug is getting where it needs to go and is having the desired effect that might be beneficial. Toxicology studies being the measurement and evaluation of the toxic or safety of the drug. But it's not just those studies, it's also manufacturing information. We always want to make sure that drugs that patients are receiving are high quality. They're not going to have, for example, impurities that might be harmful, and that patients are actually getting the active product that they're supposed to be in the right amount. So we want to make sure there's consistent manufacturing. And then also the plans, the clinical trial protocols and investigator information for this first in human study. A phase 1 study is our smallest study type. It's also our shortest study type, where we're really giving a drug in small amounts to a small number of patients for a short period of time to try to identify the most common safety issues and often at various dose levels to see, which doses are more or less tolerable. This helps us identify the most common side effects of a drug, see how it's metabolized and excreted. So again, we want to see, is it getting to the target cells and tissues and organs within the body where it's going to have its beneficial effect. And so we can evaluate all of that in phase 1. Once we've completed that and we have some assurance of reasonable assurance of safety, perhaps some early signs that the drug is having the effect it's intended, then we advance that product into phase 2 clinical trials. Phase 2 trials, as you'll see, that we're getting each time a little longer and evaluating it in more individuals. I didn't mention this, but phase 1 trials sometimes can be in healthy volunteers. Other times, often this is the case in rare diseases like Rett, where they would be actually evaluated in phase 1 in individual patients. Phase 2 studies, however, are always in the patient population that we are hoping the drug will be safe and effective for. In phase 2, we begin now to really start to look more at effectiveness. So not so much solely focusing on safety, although we always are evaluating safety. And we want to see, if the drug can work, and we look to see if there's some ways to assess treatment benefit early on, some early markers. Perhaps these are laboratory measures or imaging or early, signs that it's improving symptoms, for example, to see if the drug can work. And sometimes in this stage, we're also beginning to evaluate that drug benefit, not only looking at those who are treated, but also those who are untreated. And a common way to do this is through use of a placebo. This is the so-called sugar pill to see if, what changes can be attributable to the drug versus perhaps just being in the clinical trial itself. Once we've gone through phase 2, we then go into phase 3. These are kind of the traditional large-scale studies that you might have heard of, often randomized and placebo-controlled. Here, because they're longer, it allows us to evaluate not only initial drug effects, but the duration of drug effects over time, as well as because these studies are larger, we can actually have enough people to see if there's differences between, different ages, different severity, other key kind of prognostic variables, to see if there's differences within those subgroups. And throughout development, we can still be evaluating varying dosages of the drug to see if that makes a difference as well. These phase 3 studies also give us an opportunity to evaluate safety, including long-term safety, as well as beginning to, as we broaden the population from early phase to later phase studies, we're recruiting more people. We want this to be a fairly representative population, so we can evaluate, for example, drug-drug interactions to see if the investigational drug is having any kind of negative consequence with drugs that are typically used within the patient population. So these phase 3 studies are really the studies that establish drug benefit. Sometimes you might hear these referred to as pivotal studies. And this is what FDA uses as the primary basis for determining a drug's benefit. So once this full set of clinical trials are concluded, and in rare diseases, it isn't always as linear as phase 1, 2, and 3. Many times, phase 1 and 2 studies may be combined into a single study, or the goals of phase 2 and 3 studies may be combined. But once we've assessed those different kind of research goals across all 3 phases, then we can go to FDA and have what's called a pre-new drug application or pre-biologics license application. That's that NDA and BLA you see. Those are the marketing applications that FDA reviews to determine if a drug can be approved. Before we submit one of those applications, we want to meet with FDA and see, present the data from those pivotal studies, discuss how they were analyzed, and see if there's any major unresolved issues. There might, for example, be things raised that require additional studies or maybe additional analyses. But you want to know what those are before you submit your NDA or BLA. Once you've had that meeting and you get that alignment with the agency, then you can submit that NDA or BLA, which is really a comprehensive kind of compilation of all of the data from preclinical through all phases of development. So it's quite a large submission. That goes to FDA for review. They first check to make sure it's a complete application. They assign it to a review team, and that review team assesses whether the drug's effectiveness has been demonstrated for its proposed use. So if it's being proposed to be used within a specific disease in a specific setting, that's what FDA is looking to see if it's actually effective for doing that. FDA is also looking at the safety of the drug, and they want to make sure there's adequate information to conclude that the drug is safe. And that safety, though, is relative. It's relative to the benefits of the drug. So think of this as like a scale. You put the benefits on one side, the risks on the other. The benefits need to outweigh the risks. And then finally, FDA is also still here evaluating the manufacturing methods and controls, again, to make sure that the product is going to be produced in a consistent and high quality way. You may have heard of FDA advisory committees. These are public meetings that occur while FDA is reviewing an NDA or a BLA. This allows FDA to ask questions and get outside expert input, including input from a patient representative around some of these review issues. And so those advisory committee deliberations and votes are just that, they're advisory. FDA doesn't have to follow their vote or their feedback, but it does help inform FDA's decision. So ultimately, if FDA approves a drug, their role and the role of the drug companies don't stop there. There is post-market safety surveillance. In clinical trials, we're only evaluating it in a limited number of people in a pretty controlled environment. And so when the drug's out in the real world, it's going to be accessed by a larger number of people and a wider range of environments. And so we're going to learn new safety information that can be reported, and FDA can help continue to make sure that the benefits still outweigh the risks. So with that background about how drugs actually are developed, I want to just spend a couple of minutes about talking about FDA's role, what they do and what they don't do. So in that process, it's important to know that FDA is not actually developing drugs. It's the researchers, pharmaceutical companies, and sometimes even nonprofit groups that are conducting or funding this research and doing the drug development. So that means FDA is also not the one that's testing these drugs. They're not running the trials. They're not on site when these clinical trials are being conducted. Again, it's those researchers who are running the clinical trials, and the drug companies are sponsoring those trials. I also want to talk a little bit about an area about once drugs are on the market. So once FDA approves a drug, they don't have any authority to regulate the practice of medicine. So what this means is that FDA is regulating how drugs get developed and how the drug companies can market them, but they're not regulating what your doctors can do. So doctors are free to prescribe FDA-approved drugs for other conditions or in other settings. And you might know the term off-label. This is what's known as off-label use. Similarly, FDA is not involved in the regulating the price of medicine or insurance coverage. So FDA, when they're making their decisions, they have no authority to consider what the drug price will be. They actually don't even have that information on hand. That's not part of an NDA or a BLA application. So price and access are out of scope for what the FDA is involved in. That being said, I mentioned what FDA doesn't do. Even though they're not the ones developing drugs, they do have a role in helping facilitate drug development. This is part of their mission to help promote the public health. And through this, FDA reviewers, they're seeing every drug that's being developed, and they're seeing what works, what doesn't work, what can help evaluate drugs in the most efficient way. And so drug developers, the researchers and companies, they can go and meet with FDA to get technical help. FDA can weighs in on the design of clinical trials. And this happens through a series of meetings throughout all of those stages of drug development. So FDA is helping in a way by providing that insight and guidance. This was just a very high-level overview of drug development and FDA's role. If you are interested in more information about this, FDA has some great resources on their website at this URL on the slide here for your reference. So with that as background, now we're going to transition to hearing about where your voices fit into that process. And I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Larry Bauer, who's going to walk us through and introduce this idea of patient-focused drug development.
Thank you so much, James. That was a great overview of the FDA and the drug review process. I would like to thank Jana and Dominique for the kind introductions today. It's been a pleasure working with you to help prepare this meeting. Next slide. So we're talking about the meeting that we're preparing for, and a little bit now about what the purpose of this meeting is. So the Food and Drug Administration, they wanted a more systematic way to gather the patient perspective about different diseases and what were the different treatment options that were available to people. This information, hearing directly from patients and families, it helps inform the FDA, and it informs their understanding of the context for benefit and risk assessments and decision-making for new drugs. You know, the FDA reviews every new drug that is developed in this country, and they have to evaluate the benefits versus the risks, which we'll talk about in a little bit more in depth in a second. And patient input helps the FDA during drug development and the review of an application for marketing a new drug. So this is what we call the benefit risk assessment. So when a new drug is studied, the company sends all the data at the end of the process. They send everything to the FDA, and the FDA has to make this incredible decision. Should we let this drug go forward and be, available for prescription? Or do we say, no, we're going to put it on hold, and there either has to be more research or we just don't think it's safe enough? So they have to analyze the condition. What is the disease that the drug is for? They also want to learn about what are the current treatment options. So are there already FDA-approved drugs for that disease, or is this going to be the first one? And then they look at the data from all of the clinical studies. They look at what were the benefits that data showed, and then what were the risks. So what side effects did people that were in that study, what side effects did they have? How serious were those side effects? And how can we manage the side effects? For instance, if a side effect was headache and it responded well to Motrin, okay, that's a very manageable side effect. So that goes into their evaluation process. The meeting that we're about to have really provides information on those first two bullets, the analysis of the condition and the current treatment options. Next slide. So we are planning a Rett syndrome externally led patient-focused drug development meeting. The framework for the discussion questions in this meeting, they came from the FDA's, the benefit risk framework that you just saw, and they represent important considerations in FDA's decision-making. We reviewed this and other disease area questions, and we tailored our agenda and panel questions to try and communicate the most important information related to Rett syndrome. FDA has emphasized to us that active patient involvement and participation is the key to the success of these meetings. And it's very heartening when I look at the participant list and I see 117 people have tuned in today. That's awesome for this rare disease. Next slide. So one of the main outcomes from this meeting is something called the Voice of the Patient Report. So once the meeting is completed, we will prepare a written Voice of the Patient report. This report is a summary of the caregiver and audience testimony, the polling data that we will collect, as well as any written, submitted written comments that people give us. This document, like I said, it summarizes the entire day, and it's a key communication to FDA review staff as well as regulated industry, the people developing drugs, about what patients and caregivers most want to see in a new treatment. FDA really wants this information, and it informs them about ways to develop more meaningful treatments for Rett syndrome. Next slide. So now a little bit about how to actually participate in the meeting, which we hope that you all do. So who is this meeting for? It's for Rett syndrome patients and caregivers. We hope to get a lot of FDA staff in the audience, as well as people from pharma and biotech companies, and anyone interested in learning. It's a public meeting. You can invite your family, friends, your doctor friends, anyone to attend. When the meeting is going to take place on March 11th this year from 10 a.m. to 3:00 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. There'll be a lunch break in the middle of the day, and where it's going to be a virtual meeting. Because of COVID, we have decided to have this 100% virtual meeting, and you can get information here at rettpfdd.org about how to register for the meeting. And the meeting is going to have an interactive live stream. Next. So just an overview of what the day will look like. As I said, it'll be from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. In the morning, when the meeting starts, we'll have a welcome and introductory comments from the meeting co-moderator, as well as from the Food and Drug Administration. We'll have a background on Rett syndrome and clinical trials provided by a Rett syndrome expert. This will be a 15-minute overview of Rett syndrome to just give everybody listening in the audience a basic understanding of Rett syndrome from a clinical and scientific point of view. After that, the rest of the day will be broken into two main topics. The first one in the morning will be, how does Rett syndrome and Rett syndrome symptoms affect your life, you or your loved one's life? And the second topic is, how do you manage these symptoms, and what are the current and future approaches that you take to treatment? The topics will include pre-recorded patient and caregiver testimonies. I mean, in this case, it would be just caregiver testimonies, polling questions, and then a moderated discussion with you, the entire audience. Then we'll summarize the day and have some closing comments. Next slide. So what are the discussion questions that we will be posing to you on the day of the meeting? So in the morning, for topic 1, living with Rett syndrome, the disease, symptoms, and daily impacts, some of the things we would like to discuss are, and that we'd like you to start actually thinking about now so that you'll call in on the day of the meeting. Of all the symptoms of Rett syndrome, which 1 to 3 symptoms have the most significant impact on your loved one's life? And then, how does Rett syndrome affect your loved one on best and worst days? Can you describe your days, your best days and your worst days? So what does a really good day look like, and what is the most challenging day? What does it look like? Are there specific activities that are important that your loved one cannot do at all or as fully as you would like because of Rett syndrome? So what are the impacts of Rett? Next slide. To continue on this topic, we're going to ask, how have symptoms changed over time? So how has your loved ones, from the time that they were diagnosed? Some of you will be maybe earlier in the disease, some maybe have had the disease for years. How have the symptoms changed over time? And how has your loved one's ability to cope with the symptoms changed over time? We'd also like to hear from you. What do you fear the most as your loved one gets older? So what worries you the most about your loved one's condition, and what frustrates you the most about your loved one's condition? Next slide. And as you can see, these topics are things that only people that are living with the condition can answer. The FDA, they're scientists, they're doctors, they maybe have a medical understanding, but this is kind of looking behind the scenes on Rett syndrome. We'll have a lunch break, and then in the afternoon, we'll move to topic 2. What are the current challenges to treating Rett syndrome? So what are you currently doing to manage Rett syndrome symptoms? What kind of medications are you using? Any special dietary interventions? Things like, special therapies, special devices. And we'd like to know, how well do these treatments treat the most significant symptoms of Rett syndrome? So are they successful? Are they working? Which ones work the best? Which ones maybe not so much? And then what are the most significant downsides to your current treatments? And how do they affect your loved one's daily life? You know, every new drug has side effects, and some of those are more manageable than others, but some rise to the level of where you actually have to, you know, change medications because the side effects are so bad. And then finally, we'd like to know, short of a complete cure, which we know everybody is looking for, what specific things would you look for in an ideal new treatment for Rett syndrome? So what symptoms would be the most important to treat, and where would you like to see the biggest change in your child's life? Next. So this is a little bit about the discussion format on the day of the meeting. So for each of those panels that I just described, we'll have a group of caregivers. There will be 5 people that were pre-identified before the meeting. The purpose of hearing from these 5 people is to help set the foundation for the broader audience discussion that will follow. These panelists were selected to reflect a range of experiences with the condition. You know, we're sorry that we couldn't have more people involved, but these people are, you know, going to give us at least a basic representation. And then once we hear from those 5 people, the patients in the audience and online will have a chance to answer polling questions. These polling questions are done on your cell phone or on your tablet. And the purpose of these are to be a starting off point for the live discussion. So after we do some polling questions, we'll have a live discussion with caregivers in the audience. The purpose of this is to build on the experiences shared by the panel. And our moderator, who's James, will ask questions and invite you to submit responses in writing, or preferably to call in to provide live comments. We really hope on March 11th that as many of you as possible are able to call in and become part of the live discussion. Next. So here's a few tips for effective participation on the day of the meeting. Please remember FDA's role and the purpose of the meeting. Review these discussion questions in advance so that you can start thinking already about what some of your responses might be. And if you have something important to share, relate it to the most appropriate topic or panel question that's just been posed to the audience, and then pick up the phone and call in. There will be information at the top of the screen on the day of the meeting with the call-in number. It's very simple. You just call in on your cell phone and you'll be answered by an operator, and you'll be put into a queue, and we will try to get to as many of you that are calling in as possible. It's okay on the day of the meeting to reiterate a feeling or experience that someone else has already voiced, that it might be similar to your experience, but give it a personal or unique perspective as you tell the story. Try to keep your comments concise and focused on what the question, you know, responding to the question. There are many voices to be heard about this emotional topic, and we hope to hear from as many people as possible so we get as broad of representation of the Rett community as possible. And you can always send in additional comments after the meeting. So next slide. So to participate in the discussion, it's by webcast, so you'll be participating in the polling and then calling in comments and then also giving written submissions. Your responses will be kept confidential. We'll just use your first name. One of the things when you write in, there'll be the opportunity to continue to write comments for 30 days after the meeting is over. And we hope to include as many of those comments as possible in the Voice of the Patient report that's submitted to the FDA. And once again, the registration link is at rettpfdd.org. Next slide. So in summary, this is your opportunity to be part of this important meeting. You personally can have a meaningful impact on clinical trial design and drug development. Your collective voices must be heard at the beginning of the process to help. We want companies to design trials that better meet your needs, And we want to help the FDA assess risks and benefits with a full understanding of the impact of Rett syndrome and what your patient and caregiver perspective is. So please participate in the meeting on March 11th. Block it out on your calendars from 10 to 3. You don't have to be there for the whole time. You can, if you have to have a call or something for work, you could come in and out, but we hope as many of you as possible can be there for the whole day. So please join and help make a difference. Next slide. So we have a few minutes left. I know this is an important part to answer any questions that you might have. We've given you a lot of information today. Please put your questions into the Q&A box. And if any questions that we don't get to today or something that comes up, a new question that comes up, please email either Jana or Dominique. And I think most of you probably have their email addresses, but they're here on this slide as well. And we also want you to know if there's something that you want to revisit about this webinar that we've done, it will be available for later viewing on the Rett Syndrome EL-PFDD website, which once again is rettpfdd.org.
Great. Thank you, Larry. This is James again. While Larry was finishing up there, looking and seeing that we have quite a few questions that have been coming in throughout the presentation. So I think, Jana, Dominique, Larry, and I will do our best to give you those answers to those questions. Thank you for putting them through. I'm sure if you asked it, it's likely others had the same question. So I'm going to start with some of the questions that were about the drug development process, since that's where we started today's presentation. There's been a few different questions about what different types of technologies or types of medical products this meeting applies to. And it does apply across the board. So that includes traditional drugs, but also cell therapies, gene therapies, if there was a vaccine approach even, as well as gene editing. This can also impact medical devices. So whether that's, tools for better diagnosis or screening or monitoring, device approaches to treating or communication or mobility. This can also help inform the part of FDA that regulates medical devices, which we didn't talk much about today. So this input can be used across the board. There was also a question about how this information can be used, even though there already are clinical trials underway in Rett syndrome. So there's those investigational new drug applications are already approved. Studies are being, at various stages of clinical trials are already underway. Can this information still be useful for those studies? And the answer is this is going to be useful across the board. So, those products that are already being studied, if they're in phase 1 or 2, as they're moving into phase 3, this meeting will help in terms of designing that phase 3 study and making sure we measure things that are important to you all. For any ongoing phase 3 studies, this information that FDA will get from you will help them in making that benefit risk decision that both Larry and I talked about. Make sure that they're prioritizing if they see a treatment effect that you all say is important, that they're going to give that the appropriate weight when they're making that benefit risk decision. And then, of course, for all of those products that are not yet in the clinic, this will be able to be used throughout development. So there just a couple more on drug development. I'm trying to get through those more quickly so we can get to some on the PFDD front. There's a question about how long this takes, both drug development and review. Drug development takes many, many years. It usually takes over 10 years from when the product is first discovered to when it is ultimately approved. And many products, there was a question about, how many, what's the success rate? It is fairly low from products being discovered to ultimately being approved. But each of those steps that you make it through, whether it's getting through and getting an IND, making it past phase 1, phase 2, significantly improves the chances. And that's why that kind of staged process is in place, is to help ensure that those that are most likely to actually help, patients are the ones that are being studied in the broader, in the larger studies. In terms of FDA's review, that process, the review of an NDA or BLA, is a standard review is 10 months. But for a serious disease where there's an unmet medical need, which Rett syndrome would definitely qualify for, that FDA does what's called a priority review, which is a 6-month review. So it cuts 4 months off that review timeframe. So the vast majority of the time to get a drug approved is not while FDA is actually reviewing it, it's to do all of those different studies that are required, to build that body of evidence to support an approval. So I'm just looking here at the questions we have. I've seen a couple questions. I'm going to ask Larry and then Jana and Dominique to speak to this, about, siblings, other family members, or even people's doctors and whether they can participate.
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, it's a public meeting. I would like to we've also heard from Katerina Bobirava asking about whether families from Eastern Europe can participate. So the answer there is definitely yes. We'd like to have people calling in and, joining the meeting from all over the world. People just need to register, but we actually really hope that you do include families, even distant family members that maybe don't know that much or don't understand what Rett syndrome is or what it's like for your family to live with Rett syndrome. So the meeting is a public meeting and it's open for everyone.
Jana or Dominique, do you want to expand on who all, within this Rett community, it would be great to hear from on the meeting day?
I think Larry really covered it. This is really open for all those that are affected by Rett syndrome, and people can participate as a listener to learn more about what that patient experience is like for those that are more closely affected by Rett syndrome. But this is open, as Larry said, to the public. He mentioned Eastern Europe because that's where one question came from, but really that it can be from any country. I see a couple other countries being listed. This is of course a meeting with the FDA, who looks at drugs in the US, but it is open to an international community.
Yes, particularly in rare disease settings like this, drug development is global in nature. So FDA knows it's going to be reviewing data perhaps from around the world. So it does take into account responses from, people that live outside of the US as well. So this is a global meeting in terms of who can participate. Another question, Larry, maybe you can address is, what's the difference between the FDA-led and these externally led PFDD meetings? And perhaps more importantly, what is the implication, and are the FDA-led ones given preference?
That's a great question. So this whole process of having these meetings was started by the FDA in 2012 because they really wanted to get this kind of information. When they first started having meetings, it was a little bit of an experiment to see how successful this would work. So the FDA held 26 meetings, some for rare diseases, some for more common diseases. And after each one, a voice of the patient report was created. And the FDA made the determination that this is a very successful process, but with over 7,000 rare diseases and all of the common diseases, there is no way that the FDA could plan and execute all these meetings. So they decided to turn it over to the patient advocacy communities, and different advocacy groups could request to have an externally led meeting. And like we've mentioned so far, there's been over 50 of these meetings for a broad range of diseases. Once again, some for rare diseases, and then for some for more common things like allergies and hearing loss. The meetings, I think, are equally successful because the externally led meetings have been designed based on how the FDA ran their meetings. We use the same discussion questions. I think that the externally led meetings are actually a little bit better because we actually have time to work with these panelists and to prepare people, like to have this webinar in advance of the meeting to help prepare the patient community. When the FDA did it, they just kind of jumped in and on the day of the meeting, and there wasn't any of this additional preparation. But the outcome, the voice of the patient report, is similar, whether it was the meeting was led by the FDA or an advocacy organization. And these reports become very important to the review staff at the FDA. Like when a new drug would come in for review, a drug being developed for Rett syndrome, the reviewers would go to the voice of the patient report and review what they heard from caregivers on the day of the meeting.
Thank you, Larry.
Sure.
Another question that I'll throw to you, and then I'll take one, is that there's a couple of questions about clarifying panelists and versus other participants. So one question is, have those caregivers that are serving as panelists already been selected? And then the other question is, is it the panelists that are answering all of these questions? Or is it someone else? So hopefully you can help clarify for those people.
Well, that's a very, very good question. The panelists, there were 5 for the morning and 5 for the afternoon. They have already been selected. We're sorry once again that we couldn't have more of you participate at that level. Each of those panelists is going to prepare a 5-minute pre-recorded statement. So they will not be live on the day of the meeting. They might, attend the meeting remotely to watch, but their presentations will not be live. The questions that James poses to the audience are for all the rest of you. So that's why we're having this webinar today, is to try to really spark your enthusiasm to participate in the meeting and to call in on the day of the meeting. And once again, if we don't get to you, you can always write in anything that you would like to respond to in the questions.
Thank you, Larry.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe a question for Janet or Dominique. One question is the externally led PFDD meeting for Rett syndrome patients and caregivers only, or is it also for MECD2 duplication as well?
Yes, so this meeting is specifically for Rett syndrome, whether you're male or female, or your loved one is male or female, anyone with an MECD2 mutation can attend. We're not specifically focusing on MECD2 duplication.
Thank you.
Can I just add, there's one question that came in from Italy. I'd like to say buonasera to Eufrasia Fonzo. Grazie mille per la tua domanda. She's asking us if she'd like to know what is the drug treatment for Rett that's in the latest stage of trial development, and when are gene therapy trials going to take place. Eufrasia, may I ask that you please send that question in to either Dominique or Jana, and we'll probably handle that offline to get you the accurate information for that, okay? So thank you for tuning in. I know it's late in Italy tonight, so.
So I saw that we had a question asking if higher numbers attending will have an impact on the outcome. And I will say, yes, the more voices we hear from throughout that PFDD meeting, the better, because we want to hear a really representative set of inputs. And so the more of those voices we hear, the more participants we have in those polling questions, which every participant will be able to help answer. Really will give us the broadest, sense of experiences and preferences and priorities for this community. So yes, please do participate. We understand not everybody will be able to participate live, whether it's if you're on the other side of the world, it might be in the middle of the night, or you have to work, or any life happens. So we totally understand and invite you to submit written comments. There was a question about how to submit written comments. You can go to that same webpage, rettpfdd.org, and for 30 days after the meeting, as well as sometime leading up to the meeting, there will be a comment box that you'll be able to submit your comments to. You can always email Jana or Dominique as well with any questions or comments that you have along the way as well. Another question for Jana and Dominique about the scope of the meeting. Will we be paying attention to adults with Rett?
Yes, that's a
Go
great
ahead, Dominique.
question.
Go ahead.
That's a great question. And absolutely, adults are an important part of the Rett community. And this is really to address the entire population of those that do have Rett syndrome.
Thank you.
I saw a question come in about whether the Voice of the Patient report will be available to the Rett community. Great question, and it will. Once the report is completed, it will be posted on the Rett organization's websites, and it will be publicly available for anyone to read and to be able to see a video recording of the meeting as well as a transcript of the meeting. So thank you.
So there's a
I
couple of
think that
questions.
also,
Oh, please go ahead.
I'm sorry, James. I just wanted to say, I think that also answers Paul's question about how the views and information get incorporated into the review and approval process, and it is through the Voice of the Patient report.
Yeah.
There was a question about whether, the top, maybe 3 or 5 goals for this meeting. I'll say, I think Larry and I covered a lot of kind of core goals in terms of, helping inform clinical trial design, helping inform benefit risk decisions. That's really, with our FDA hats on, the goals that FDA has. They want to be able to inform those decisions. But maybe Dominique and Jana, as you were, putting together this letter of intent to host this meeting and have been working so hard to put it on, maybe you can speak to some of your views on how you would, measure success, for this meeting.
Sure. So I can go first, Dominique. So when we were writing the letter of intent, we were thinking of the different audiences and who we wanted to benefit from this meeting. And one group obviously is families, one is FDA, and one is the drug developers and the therapeutic developers. And so another goal that we have, not only to inform FDA and allow them to have more information when they're making their regulatory decisions, we also wanted to inform companies and help them figure out, what do they need to focus on in their clinical trials, what symptoms are most problematic for families, where are the greatest needs for improvement, and help them make and design their trials better, more efficiently, and get them done more effectively. So that was another group that we focused on.
And I'll just add to what Jane already shared, is that really this is the greatest opportunity for individuals who are affected by Rett syndrome to have their voice heard. So this is really the one time that the FDA can hear directly from those that are, the caretakers or the parents of individuals with Rett that know what life is like. And can really describe that, because the FDA reviewers, when they're looking at either a clinical trial application or the new drug application, they know what's in the books, but they don't know what life is really like. It's really quite different. And so that is really one of the metrics of success, is for them to be able to really incorporate what life is really like and what is actually a meaningful change to those that are living with this when considering either, again, that application to start a clinical trial, the IND, or the application to approve a therapeutic.
And I think that's the perfect question to end on. I think that was a great rapid fire, a very engaged community. So we want to thank you all for all of your questions. I'll pass it back to Jana and Dominique for any parting thoughts.
Thank you, James and Larry, for joining us today. It was a wonderful presentation. We got so much feedback from the audience. Thank you for putting in your questions and for your attention today. We're really looking forward to putting on this meeting with you in the future. And thank you so much for your participation today. Have a wonderful day. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.